to another week of Community Group. As we're going through this Anything Goes series, we have a wide range of subjects that we're covering. So the next couple of weeks, we're going to be bringing in some special guests. Today, we have one of our executive pastors here, Jeremy. Welcome. And we're going to be addressing the question that if God is fully in control, how does he allow evil and suffering to happen? Jeremy, Mark covered 11 points in this sermon, so there's a lot of information. I think this is a topic that whether you're a skeptic or whether you're a believer, that we really have a kickback against. If you could summarize kind of what are those key points that we should remember, whether it's with sharing with other people, answering the question, or even for our own personal faith, what are those key things that we should remember?
Right. Yeah, I think this topic's really important to skeptics and obviously to Christians because it gets at the true human experience. So we all deal with this. And so it's great about how the Bible and Christianity comes at this topic is that it doesn't deny us our humanity or our experience. It actually speaks right into the realness of what we deal with in life. And it doesn't try and avoid it or push it to the side or say, you know, you don't have to go through it or what. It's real. So it actually speaks to something in all of us, whether we're a skeptic or not. I think if I was to boil down kind of a bit of what he talked about, the tension we live in theologically is when we come under the authority of the Bible, we have to take the bits and pieces of truth we're told, because the Bible doesn't tell us every detail about everything, about how all existence works. So we take all these things we learn from the Bible, we have to hold them in tension and go, okay, here are the truths we're learning. So on the one hand, we have this truth of the sovereignty of God. So the Bible's really clear. Nothing happens that is outside of God's control. He's fully in control of everything. But at the same time, he's good. And so how is it that he can allow things that aren't good to happen? And so that's part of the tension. Well, we also learn in the Bible very clearly that each one of us as human beings will be held accountable for our decisions. So we live in a tension, biblically, of the sovereignty of God to be in control and the ability he gives us to be judged and held accountable and have responsibility for the decisions we make in the world. Exactly how that economy works, the Bible doesn't explain in detail for us. We have to live in that tension. But we know both things are true biblically. So evil and suffering exists because God is allowing us that agency to make bad decisions in life. And so because we are left to be something other than robots, where he dictates for us every decision we make, we're going to make bad decisions. And so he's allowing that in the grand plan of what he's doing in the universe because that's the better way, according to his supreme knowledge, much greater than ours. And that's the reality we live in. So it's not a problem that there's evil and suffering in the world and that God is in control and good when you understand both of those truths together.
Yeah, and understanding that God is in control, we think about back to the story of Joseph, where what was intended for evil, God used for good.
Right.
So taking in mind that, and then also the story of Job, how can we see that God used that evil and suffering in Job's life for actually good for Job?
Right. I think there are two big ways that the Job story really inspires me and hopefully would inspire all of you. So one of those is in the Job story, throughout his experience of immense suffering and loss, one of the big questions he keeps asking himself and his friends is, have I lost God? Is God gone, or do I still have him? Because what I'm experiencing is really hard, and there's been a lot of loss and suffering in my life. So is that a sign that God actually isn't with me anymore? But then at the end of the story, we find out that no, God's been with him the whole time, and he speaks to Job, and Job hears everything God has to say to him, and Job is then comforted and relieved because he's understood that in his worst suffering, God was there. And so I think for me, and hopefully for us, one of the big takeaways of that story is you can actually be confident in the true, real, difficult suffering that you go through, and you don't have to deny it. You can be empowered to embrace and live into that hardship. You don't have to pretend you're not going through it, but you can know that while you're going through it, God is still there. You don't have to convince him to find you or convince him to finally look upon you and relieve your suffering as if he doesn't know. He's actually there and he's with you in it. And the second big thing I think I've learned from the story of Job and studying it through the years, and I love this book, is at the end of the book, Job actually says something really interesting. He says in chapter 42, I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. And for me, that's so important that through the experience he went through of having to lean on his knowledge of knowing who God was through his suffering experience, at the end, he came out the other side in a deeper relationship with God than he was at the beginning. And I think about that in my own life with, say, my marriage and health problems that my wife has had. And so the struggle and the tension and the suffering we've endured through that, we now come out, 15, 16 years later in our marriage, and we go, okay, we're at a different level than we were at without all of this. And it's the same with God, I think. And all of us have that opportunity in our suffering. And that's not to make our suffering some kind of like trite thing, like, hey, it just, it's a great blessing for you. I mean, no, I think that's what's great about the Bible is it humanizes your suffering, but at the same time goes, hey, there's still hope in it because the ultimate purpose God has for you is dependence on him. It's not avoiding hardship in life. And if dependence on him is the most important thing for you and for me, like eternally, then there is opportunity in that hardship. And knowing God is there with you in it helps us be able to endure through that so that we can get to that other side where we do go deeper with him and we do end up in a place with him, ultimately eternally, that we never could have been at before.
Thanks, Jared. So now we're going to turn over to you guys to go through the discussion questions, and we'll come back briefly for a quick application and kind of how do we go from here, whether we are personally in the midst of some sort of suffering in our life or whether that's something we may be walking into in 5, 10, 20 years. Thanks, guys. We hope you had a great discussion, and we would just want to leave you with one final thought. Scripture doesn't promise that we are going to have a life free of trial and tribulation, but actually says that we will face this as disciples of Christ. Jeremy, previously when we were talking about the book of Job, you brought up an interesting point that really resonated with me. You brought up so much we focus on how Job responded when he was in the midst of his suffering and afterwards, but Job 1 really lays down who Job was before that happened on. What can we learn from that?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. We kind of marvel at Job and we say, wow, what a man of faith. And we just think about, like you said, because he endured this thing. But sometimes we forget, verse 1 of the first chapter, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. Well, there's a lesson for all of us that if we want to be the kind of people who can face suffering and trial and go deeper on the other end of that with God in our relationship with him, that doesn't happen by accident. Mm-hmm. We don't just come against tragedy with no context and we haven't prepared for it in our life and then come out the other end. We can, but not typically come out the other end much deeper with him. Sometimes he'll work that into our lives and that would be a blessing, but we learn, I think, from here, there's prep work we do. What is it I'm doing in my life that prepares me to have the kind of faith to be able to endure the hardest of the hard thing in life and come through that with God, deeper with God on the other end of that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. So in this next week, take some time for self-evaluation, self-reflection, or talk about it amongst yourselves or with your spouse or with friends. What are you intentionally doing now to strengthen your relationship with God, knowing that as part of this life on earth, trials and tribulations will be coming. Community is an important part of that as well. I know for me personally, when I went through a dark period in my life, it was at the end of the day, my faith, my relationship with God, and then my relationships, my family, that really got me through that period. So as a community group, we are the family of Christ. We are family together. We're heading into the month of October, or depending which day of the week you're listening, this is October already. Going through the month, think about what are ways maybe you as a community group can intentionally, whether building community within. So take a week off of your regular curriculum and maybe have a potluck together. Some groups will have guys and girls night separately just to really focus on building those relationships with each other as well. As much as these nights doing the discussion questions are the staple of community group, they shouldn't be be the only substance. Or maybe if you're a group that is well established already and really you feel God speaking to your heart to be more missional in your community, think about a way that maybe you can go out into your community sometime in the month of October, whether that is inviting another family out to go to the pumpkin patch, or that is also maybe just intentionally reaching out to that coworker and inviting them out for coffee. Just brainstorm with your group and remember that as much as we want to encourage community with amongst ourselves, we are also called to reflect the heart of God in our community as well. Thanks, guys.